Committee will come to order. Last month, when Secretary Mattis testified on the new National Defense Strategy, he said, quote, "Our competitive edge has eroded in every domain of warfare, air, land, sea, space, and cyber," end quote. That statement has two relevant points to today's hearing. First, space is a domain of warfare, not just an enabler. Second, we're falling behind where we should be when it comes to space. Today's hearing will discuss how we catch up. As we refocus our defense efforts on strategic rivals, it's clear that they are putting significant effort into space. I believe the American people still do not fully realize how dependent our country is on space, not just for military and intelligence purposes, but in our everyday lives as well. That dependence creates a vulnerability, which, like in the other domains, we must count on the American military to protect. This committee has focused a lot on readiness and rebuilding our military. When it comes to space, there are a number of questions that need answers. For example, where should we be making our investments? Are we attracting and then developing the right kind of space warfighters? Perhaps most crucially to me, are we putting the appropriate intellectual effort into space as a warfighting domain? We look forward to the insights that our witnesses today can give us. Finally, I'd point out that this committee has been very active in trying to prepare the military and the nation for the challenges of space. We've streamlined Air Force acquisition authorities, eliminated red tape, empowered a single accountable organization for space forces within the Air Force, empowered the Deputy Secretary of Defense to oversee Air Force space reform efforts, among other things. But we will not relax our efforts. This topic is just too important. I'd yield to Ms. Davis as the acting ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Kehler, Mr. Loverro, and Mr. Harrison, we all welcome you and we thank you for being here. We look forward to your insights on adapting space as a contested domain and how we can protect our assets and deter a war in space. I ask unanimous consent to submit the Mr. Smith's remarks for the record.
Without objection. We appreciate each of you being here. We're joined by General Robert Kehler, former Commander, U.S. Strategic Command, Mr. Doug Loverro, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, and Mr. Todd Harrison, Director of the Aerospace Security Project for Center for Strategic and International Studies. Obviously, more complete bios are in the materials on each of these gentlemen. Without objection, each of your full written statements will be made part of the record. And we look forward to your comments as well as your answers to our questions. General Kehler, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, distinguished members of the committee. I am honored to be here with you today to present my views on space warfighting readiness. I'm especially pleased to be here with my two longtime colleagues, and I want to thank the members of the committee for your leadership on these important matters. As a reminder, Mr. Chairman, the views I express today are mine. I am not here representing the Department of Defense or Strategic Command or the United States Air Force. Mr. Chairman, the United States is perilously close to losing the significant advantages that come from being the world's leading spacefaring nation, and time is not on our side. Decades of dedicated investment in space have yielded important warfighting and intelligence collection benefits for the United States and our allies and partners. But our adversaries and our potential adversaries have noted these significant benefits and have moved aggressively to field forces that can challenge our space capabilities from the ground, through cyberspace, and in space. As always, deterrence is the preferred outcome, and our ability to deter a conflict that begins in or extends to space is based on our readiness to fight such a conflict. I believe classic deterrence theory applies to space. Adversaries will be deterred if they believe they cannot achieve their objectives, will suffer unacceptable consequences if they try, or both. This is not the first time the U.S. has had to consider challenges to our space capabilities, but today's problem is potentially far greater in impact. Given our dependence and that of our allies and partners on space, the loss of critical assets today could prove decisive to our ability to successfully prosecute a military campaign. As a result, the United States has to be prepared to plan and conduct complex operations in space that involve joint, interagency, and combined or allied capabilities and forces in the context of broader commercial, non-governmental, and international actors and interests. Space operations must integrate seamlessly into multi-domain operations. We should not be preparing to fight and deter an isolated space war, as some headlines would suggest. Space is an integral component of our warfighting structure, and challenges to our space capabilities must be addressed within the context of that structure. As you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, there's a lot of work underway to address the shortfalls, much of it stimulated by your interest and that of Chairman Rogers and his subcommittee. So let me take just a moment to highlight a few areas that I believe deserve special attention. First, national leadership has to align on a comprehensive plan of action, as well as the ends, ways, and means to implement such an action plan. The national security space enterprise exists within the overall national space enterprise, and its success is linked to the viability and vitality of that enterprise. The current national security strategy recognizes that unimpeded access to and use of space is of vital national interest and notes that the United States will respond to threats to our vital national interests in space at a time, place, manner, and domain of our choosing. To effectively deal with the conflict that begins or extends into space, this general policy has to be implemented in a manner that is helpful to commanders in operational planning and execution. Second, given the multiplicity of actors involved in today's military operations, including space, it's important to clarify the relationships and responsibilities among the commander of U.S. Strategic Command, other U.S. government space operators, and other actors like commercial space operators to ensure that we have unity of effort. Regarding acquisition authorities, I think it's important to align authorities with service responsibilities and delegate those authorities to the lowest feasible level. Third, countering an adversary's efforts to deny our space capabilities begins with an operational concept or CONOPS. Bringing the ongoing space CONOPS work to conclusion and updating joint force CONOPS to account for degraded or denied space capabilities are complementary and high-priority activities. Next, in my view, today's joint warfighting structure is both appropriate and adequate to prepare for and fight a space-related conflict. The commander of U.S. Strategic Command has the necessary responsibility and authority to organize his command for warfighting effectiveness, and by the way, those changes are underway, to develop plans, to conduct exercises, to establish relationships over which he doesn't have command authorities, and basically to do the things necessary to make sure that we're prepared. This is the same process we use for the other domains and the other commands, and if we use that same process, that's going to help us ensure integration of space with other efforts. Finally, space and other forces have to be equipped and trained to fulfill their mission responsibilities in the face of determined adversary action against space assets. Capability architectures, not just space architectures, but capability architectures have to become more resilient and defendable, and all forces have to be prepared and equipped to operate in an environment that assumes space assets will be degraded. Rapid acquisition, aggressively leveraging commercial capabilities, better integration with allies and coalition partners, and realistic training all play a role in addressing these issues. Mr. Chairman, you asked for my perspective on the current readiness of U.S. forces to succeed and successfully operate in a conflict that begins in or extends to the space domain. In summary, we are not yet where we need to be, but I am encouraged by the focus, commitment, and sense of urgency I see from all parties. Fortunately, we are not starting from scratch. The young men and women that make up our space forces and their leaders provide the solid foundation we need to meet the challenge. Following Desert Storm, the United States Air Force and others made great progress in bringing space support to national leaders and the warfighters. Now it's time to shift from a mindset that presumed space superiority to a mindset prepared to gain and maintain space superiority as a first condition of providing that support. From acquisition to operational execution, the U.S. needs to field a force that is ready for space conflict. Thanks again for inviting me, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Loverro?
Chairman Thornberry, Ms. Davis, members of the subcommittee, I am pleased to be here today to join General Kehler and Mr. Harrison to talk to you about an issue that is critical for the Department of Defense and for our nation, and as you've already said, DoD space warfighting readiness. Space is vital to our national security. It underpins DoD capabilities worldwide at every level, from the engagement in humanitarian assistance to conventional conflict and up to and including nuclear war. As importantly, space provides a lifeblood to U.S. economic vitality, empowering the lives of our citizens worldwide, and it increasingly represents one of those rare industrial sectors in which the U.S. continues to hold and expand its unqualified advantage. In all three space sectors, national security, civil, and commercial, the U.S. leads the world. Let's make no mistake about that. But while our leadership in both civil and commercial space remains secure, our leadership and our capabilities in national security sector are being actively and aggressively challenged, just as General Kehler has stated. Our adversaries know that the U.S. military relies on space to empower its operations and to wield an overwhelming military advantage, and they don't like it. That understanding was succinctly stated by Chinese strategist Wang Huchang 2 decades ago when he wrote that for countries that can never win a war with the United States by using the methods of tanks and planes, attacking U.S. space systems may be an irresistible and most tempting choice. His observation was not just idle speculation. It became the basis for Chinese and Russian strategy, which they have been working on ever since and which they will soon bring to fruition. Understanding all this, the question posed by the hearing today, are U.S. space warfighting forces ready, becomes particularly pertinent to understand. Unfortunately, my answer is not that different from General Kehler's answer. No, we are not ready. Or more properly, I don't believe we're on the firm path to be ready. Before we discuss why, let me make two things emphatically clear. First and most critically, this is absolutely not an indictment of the incredible members of our military armed services and intelligence community charged with this responsibility. They stand ready to maintain U.S. space capabilities in every way humanly possible, given the tools at their disposal. It's the tools that are not up to the task. Second, no adversary should mistake that statement as an invitation to attack. The fact is that U.S. space forces are robust, and faced with any attack that could be mounted today, I am fully confident they will continue to provide the U.S. with the warfighting edge to assure an adversary's defeat. But the harsh reality is that our current ability to withstand an adversary attack is based not on our warfighting readiness, but rather their lack of a fully developed and operationalized threat. If that threat did exist, then I feel the answer would be quite different. In your invitation to appear here today, you cited several elements that must be assessed to gauge our warfighting readiness. Those elements included policies, current and future capabilities, allied and commercial integration, and our organizational structure. In my written statement, I've addressed each one, and I would ask that those all be included in the record. Finally, before I close, let me add two more thoughts. First, to echo General Hyten and General Kehler have stated over and over again, deterrence and war do not occur in isolated domains. Rather, it is the sum of our capabilities and actions across all domains that leads to deterrence during peace and victory during war. But the role that space plays in this equation is paramount, because losing space degrades not only our space capability, but degrades our capability in the three other terrestrial domains as well. Assuring space forces survive assures the ability of those terrestrial forces to succeed, and that leads to the deterrence we seek. Simultaneously, we must accept that no capable adversary will hesitate to exercise their sovereign ambition to eliminate the U.S. space advantage. Regardless of how ready our space forces are, that readiness will not deter a determined attack. Therefore, we must make certain that our space forces can withstand such an onslaught. Second, while the question of space warfighting readiness is made up of many elements, I want to elevate one of them above all others, and that is the human capital element, or more specifically, the people. In my testimony, I have pointed to several areas where we need to reassess our plans, our budget, and our strategy. And I know that if we want to, we can reshape those plans and our budget and close the short-term readiness gap. But in the long term, we must face the fact that to remain ahead over the next half-century, we're going to need to grow the kind of space leaders that can think doctrinally, technically, and operationally for space in the same way we grew those leaders in the 1930s and 40s for air. We could have not done it for air from within the constraints of the pre-World War II Army personnel system. Likewise, we would not be able to do it for space from within the constraints of our first pre-war Air Force personnel system. In 1937, General Frank Andrews, for whom Andrews Air Force Base is named, wrote, I don't believe any balanced plan to provide the nation with an adequate, effective Air Force can be obtained without providing an organization individuals to the needs of such an Air Force. The creation of the United States Air Force propelled changes in air power that moved our Air Force from the equal of its contemporary counterparts to a modern force that is hands down the best in the world. The same will be true for space. If we are to assure U.S. space warfighting readiness far into the future against the rising threats we see today and those that we will face tomorrow, we must establish, either within or outside the Air Force, an organization individual to those space needs. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Harrison.
Chairman Thornberry, Representative Davis, and members of the committee, I want to begin by thanking you for the opportunity to testify today on this important and timely topic. I also want to thank my CSIS colleagues who have contributed to our work in this area, especially Zach Cooper, Caitlin Johnson, and Thomas Roberts. While the thoughts I am sharing today draw from the work our team has done, the opinions I express are not intended to represent those of my colleagues or CSIS. The United States is critically dependent on space across the full spectrum of conflict, from counterterrorism operations to high-end combat against a near-peer adversary. This dependence on space creates a vulnerability because our space systems are not protected across the full spectrum of threats. Conflict that begins or extends into space, particularly if it becomes kinetic, will not end well for anyone. Our primary focus should therefore be on deterring conflict in space, and I believe there are three main areas where we can do more to improve our deterrence posture and the readiness of our space forces. First, we need a clearer understanding and articulation of the thresholds for escalation in space, especially at the lower end of the spectrum of conflict. Ambiguous escalation thresholds can invite gray zone aggression in space, as we are seeing occur in other domains today. Adversaries are probing at the seams and finding ways to advance their own ambitions without triggering direct, overt conflict with the United States. What is different about the space domain is that we have little history to draw upon or widely accepted norms of conduct to serve as reference points. It is therefore in our interest to work with international and commercial partners to establish sensible norms of conduct and to abide by them. Another complicating factor is that adversaries can use methods of attack against our space systems that are difficult to detect and attribute and may have reversible effects, such as jamming, lasing, and cyber attacks. It is nearly impossible to deter an attack if you cannot attribute the source of the attack or know with confidence that the effects being experienced are in fact malicious. We cannot establish clear and credible thresholds without the ability to detect and attribute threats to our space systems in a timely manner. A second area where we should be focusing more effort is the development of innovative space capabilities. We're in the midst of a renaissance in commercial space, but it is difficult for the military to stay attuned to these advances if acquisition officers are rotating into space programs with little, if any, prior space experience. One potential remedy is for the Air Force to create a dedicated cadre of space acquisition professionals, both civilian and uniformed military, that are managed separately from the rest of the Air Force acquisition workforce. This would allow for more specific training, a deeper level of technical knowledge, and more relevant career experiences. The slow pace of the budgeting process is also a major roadblock to improving capabilities. Under the normal budget process, it takes about 2 years to move from having an idea to having funding to pursue that idea. Given the pace of innovation, especially in software and electronics, that is simply too long. One potential solution is to create something like a working capital fund for space innovation with greater flexibility and authorities. This would be particularly helpful for smaller prototyping and rapid response programs. A third and final area I believe needs more attention is the problem of communicating our thresholds and capabilities. While certain aspects of our national security space systems must remain secret to be effective, too often the U.S. military and intelligence community default to over-classification. Secrecy invites suspicion among our allies and partners and does little to deter our adversaries. The overclassification of information inhibits our ability to work with international partners and commercial firms, both of which can play an important role in improving the resilience of our space systems. And just as important, overclassification is effectively an overhead tax on all our space activities, adding complexity and time to everything we do. Another way to improve the communication of thresholds is to be more explicit with commercial space operators about how attacks on their systems will be treated. Without such clarity, commercial space operators may not be willing to accept the risk of doing business with the government in the event of a crisis. One approach to consider is an indemnification program for commercial satellite operators that will cover losses incurred due to a conflict in exchange for a commitment by these firms to prioritize U.S. government customers in a crisis. In conclusion, much remains to be done to improve the readiness of our national security space forces for the wide range of threats we face today. I commend the committee for focusing attention on these issues and holding the Department of Defense accountable for strengthening our deterrence posture in space. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you all. Mr. Loverro's statement really got my attention, where he says, not only are we not ready, we're not on the path to be ready. Now, this committee deals with lots of issues that we're not going to solve all of a sudden. But I think a lot of times the question for us is, are we on the right path? Are we getting there? Now, we may have differences sometimes about the sense of urgency, how quickly, and so forth. But if we're not on the path to be ready, I think that is a pretty significant thing that should require us to rethink our path. General Kehler, do you agree that we are not on the path to be ready?
I think it depends on what he means. I don't quite understand. So I'm not going to speculate. I will just say I'm not aware of, I don't think I'm aware as an outsider now of everything that's going on. What I am aware of, though, I think is significant. And if we break this down and say, are we doing the war-fighting things that are necessary, plans, courses of action, establishing command relationships, all of those things, I believe those steps are underway. And so that's because we fight with combatant commanders, and we have a combatant commander focused on this. And so I think the warfighting steps that are necessary are underway in order for us to have better plans and exercises and all the things that go with that. In terms of organizing, training, and equipping, I think that again, from what I have seen, I think that some significant decisions have been made in terms of architectures, et cetera. I'm not clear that the acquisition has caught up with that, and I would question whether our acquisition processes are sufficient to do what needs to be done in the near term. Beyond that, I would not blanket say that we're not on the right pathway. But I respect Doug Loverro's views on this, and I'd be interested in hearing more about why he thinks that. I might agree with him, but as a blanket statement, I don't.
Okay. Mr. Harrison, do you have an opinion if we're on a path to be appropriately ready for warfighting in space?
I would have to lean more towards Mr. Loverro on this one. I would say that to what General Kehler said, in terms of operations and our operational readiness today, I think we're making good progress, as far as I can tell as an outside observer. I think when it comes to long-term readiness, though, which depends much more on the space architectures that we're building and how we're thinking about operations in the future and how we're moving out towards acquiring the capabilities that we need, I don't think we're on the right track there. I think we have been stalled for several years now, for almost a decade. We have been stalled in transitioning to more resilient space architectures. And so in that sense, I think that we're not on a good path. We could do much better.
Okay, Mr. Loverro, do you want to add to your statement?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd be pleased to. So first of all, let me echo what both General Kehler and Mr. Harrison have said. We are working the warfighting plans. We are integrating space into those warfighting plans. That is active, ongoing. It began really under General Kehler, under his leadership, and has continued ever since. And again, with the tools we have at hand, our warfighters and our war planners are doing the best they have. The problem we have is that while we have an excellent vision for what we do need, and in fact, General Hyten, who appeared before this committee earlier last week, created what he called the Space Enterprise Vision. And that vision is excellent and comprehensive. We can argue whether or not it's perfect, but it's very good vision. But the plan that the Department of Defense submitted to this Congress, which is called the budget, doesn't reflect that vision. It does not reflect the elements necessary to make that vision happen. And I'll point to three specific areas that are missing. Number one, the Space Enterprise Vision includes extensive cooperation with allied and commercial, as both General Kehler and Mr. Harrison have said, and yet there is zero investment in that commitment in the budget. Second, everybody in space understands that in order to operate in space effectively and to learn how to operate in space, you're going to need to exercise and exercise extensively. That requires test assets, that requires test infrastructures. In my written testimony, I speak to the red flag exercises that occur at Nellis Air Force Base. The Air Force spends a lot of money practicing operational tactics and doctrine. We do not have an investment that represents that in space. And lastly, the things that are in the budget represent more old school space architectures that are fundamentally almost impossible to assure than new space architectures that would lead towards assurance, and they're 10 years late. We have a SATCOM jamming threat today. Today, if we went to war in the Pacific, our PACOM commander would be hard-pressed to communicate, and yet we have nothing on the books until about 2027 to solve that problem for him. And by that time, the adversary will have gone through 2 or 3 generations of his capability. That's what I mean by not being on the path.
Okay. I think there's a lot to follow up on, and I know members will want to. Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you. In many ways, I think you just addressed part of that, Mr. Loverro, of, you know, where are the gaps? I mean, what is it specifically? And Mr. Harrison, if you could perhaps pick up on that, whether it's the way the Pentagon is organized on some levels. We've talked about refining even what kind of unified or subcommand there is. What are there authorities that are missing? Is it culture? Often it is. We know that there's a slow pace sometimes to move ahead in a risk adverse culture. Can you help us define a little bit more of, you know, what is slowing that down? And what at this point, if in fact you're suggesting that we really haven't planned that for the budget, what is it that specifically could be done with some of those authorities?
Well, first, I think a lot of it is culture, that you've got a space community that many of the people grew up in an environment where space was considered to be more benign. I would argue it was never benign. There were always threats. The difference, though, was that we were more confident in our ability to deter threats in the past, and so we were willing to assume sanctuary. We had that posture for so long, I think we forgot that it was an assumption. And now we're facing a proliferation of threats, not just, with, adversaries like Russia and China that have pretty sophisticated space programs themselves, but all the way down to the level of non-state actors that can use jamming equipment. They can acquire it, they can build it, they can operate it. And I think we've been very slow because of the culture that built up over time to respond to that. Part of it also is the acquisition culture. I've worked in this as a contractor, and I can tell you that we have built up institutions within the Air Force and the other services as well, to a lesser extent, though. We've built up institutions within our military, within our FFRDCs that support the military, and even within our defense industry. And those institutions are centered around the types of capabilities that we needed in the past when deterrence was more assured. They are very slow to adjust. Those institutions are very slow to adjust to the threats that we're facing today. And so I think that's where we need to light a fire under people.
Could you be just a little more specific about that?
So, for example, we got into a mindset of building highly aggregated, very expensive satellites in small numbers. And it has proven incredibly difficult over the past decade to get the Air Force and the specific program offices to break out of that mindset that maybe we cannot be building these exquisite Battlestar Galactica satellites where we aggregate as many things on them as possible. There were good reasons to do that in the past. Those reasons don't exist anymore, and that's actually a vulnerability. We need to figure out how to build more resilient, more dispersed architectures. And I think people are just slow to make that transition because they grew up in an environment where it was all about aggregation.
Mm-hmm. Is there an alternative to that? Anybody want it? Just in that domain that you would suggest?
Well, there are. First of all, I agree with what's being said. I think we are where we are not because people have slapped their forehead and said we don't know this, but for lots of reasons. Part of it has been priorities. When our priorities are elsewhere, and we see that not only in space, but we see that in the nuclear forces, we see that in other parts of the Department of Defense where our priorities have been elsewhere. I do think there are cultural issues. I do think there are other things that contribute to this, resources and how many resources we've put to these issues, et cetera. I do think there is a cultural issue. I do think that we have the pieces in place to address those cultural issues. I think that we have been slow to try to address some of those. I would like to see us pull those pieces together, and I would like to see us give some of the current leadership more authority to move faster, and I think we must deal with our acquisition issues.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Wilson's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I very much, and thank each of you for being here. I very much appreciate the focus that the Department of Defense is putting forth on this space area of responsibility. And I'm particularly grateful for the leadership of the domain of space by Chairman Mike Rogers and Ranking Member Jim Cooper, and their very visionary sponsorship of legislation in this field now has been adopted by President Donald Trump. So they're very effective individuals. As we continue to advance our own technologies, we have to understand and be prepared for the expansion of capabilities by our adversaries across all 4 orbits of outer space. And in particular, can you identify the best you can the capabilities and challenges that other nations have identified for their activities in space, beginning with General Kehler?
Sir, I think that at least what I've observed both in uniform and now subsequent to that is that our near-peer competitors, if you single out Russia and China in particular, they have developed strategies that are specifically intended to diminish our ability to project power, diminish our ability to have global awareness, to fracture us from our allies. All of the things that we see them doing at the strategic level have a space component to them. And they have been aggressively pursuing capabilities that allow them to execute that kind of a strategy. It's part of what we would talk with the Chinese about, talk about the Chinese in terms of anti-access area denial strategies. With the Russians, we talk about their interest to dominate in the near abroad. They have escalation strategies that they believe involve space, et cetera. And so I think we need to make sure we understand their strategic approach and how space fits into that in order to be able to counter it.
Congressman Wilson, let me add to what General Kehler said, and I agree exactly with what he said. Let me change the discussion less from the strategic side and more to the material side, if I might. And if you'll permit me, I'd like to just correct something that you mentioned, because it's a misconception almost everybody has. You talked about the 4 orbits that we have. Kepler defined an infinite number of orbits. We choose to use 4. That's a foolish choice. Back in the 1960s, we launched satellites that today sit halfway between the Earth and the Moon to observe nuclear tests on the face of the Earth. We knew how to do that in the 60s. We understood that they were safer and more resilient that far away, and we could still conduct our mission. The adversary has seen how we operate in the 4 orbits that you talked about. They are ready to target every one of them, and they will target them in such a way that it will be very difficult for us to defend our capabilities. We are not constrained by gravity or physics to those placements, and yet culturally we have a hard time moving away from them. And it's a very important strategic concept to understand. It's one of those blind spots that we don't allow our people to think about, because being in geosynchronous orbit for communications is convenient. But the Army doesn't march on the sides of ridge rather than in the valley because it's convenient. They march on the sides of ridge rather than the valley because it's more protected. For military capability, we may be convenient to be in geosynchronous orbit, but it is not militarily wise to be in geosynchronous orbit. And we can launch satellites in other orbits that are far harder for an adversary to attack, much more easily to attribute the attack once the attack occurs, and much more easy to go ahead and have a proliferated constellation of capability.
Thank you for the great question. I think we're seeing our adversaries do several things. So first of all, they see the great advantages space provides us, and in some cases, they're trying to copy us and build similar space systems for themselves. We also see many of our adversaries trying to counter us and to blunt our advantage in space by developing counter space weapons. And to build on what Mr. Loverro said, we shouldn't just think about counter space weapons as kinetic ASAT weapons, that missiles that go up, blow up a satellite, create a bunch of debris. Those are troubling, but we can attribute those very quickly. We know where they come from, and it's an overt act of war if someone does that. So I think we are better able to deter those types of threats and respond to them. What I'm concerned about are the non-kinetic types of threats that we face in space.
Thank you very much. I look forward to you identifying who non-state actors are, too. Thank you.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think anyone on the panel would say space policy is a disaster and we don't know what we're doing and so on, but it seems like we're at an inflection point a little bit where we need to move faster than we are to change, sort of like the guy on the Ed Sullivan show is spinning 17 plates at the same time, trying to keep them all up and unable to prioritize because you can't. You have to keep all of them up. So he's running around trying to do this, and I feel that we're kind of at that inflection point in space policy. Like we are moving around from plate to plate to keep them all up in order to move to that next step. And so I don't know how timely my question is, because I think one of the plates that is getting spun here has to do with the workforce side of it, and what kind of workforce do we need in the future. But if we don't have an idea of policy, then we don't know what kind of workforce we need in space and what kind of warfighter we need for space. But having said that, maybe you can help answer some of those questions, like the kind of capabilities and qualifications that are needed now in whether it's test pilots or space acquisition professionals or satellite communications specialists. Who do we need in our military and civilian side of the world in the Pentagon to implement whatever we're moving towards? General, have you given some thought to that over the last 4 years and 3 years in retirement? Or?
Might surprise you to know that, yes, I have.
Great.
And especially the last couple of days before coming here. And by the way, all the way back to 2001, when then the Space Commission reported out that developing what they called the space cadre was going to be one of the critical things that needed to happen as we went forward. So if we were looking at the kind of space talent that we need in the future, I would say it's mixed. We're going to need people in uniforms who understand the basics and fundamentals of joint warfighting, while at the same time having expertise in the space domain and the technical requirements that go along with it. Think about submariners and submarines and the underwater environment here as a model for what we need. Those are war fighters, but they operate in a unique domain with unique platforms that can do things by themselves as well as operate with task forces, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's a good model for us to think about. We need civilians who work in the Department of Defense and and come to work every day with the deeper technical expertise and savvy in order to be thinking about how do we bring commercial opportunity in as well as do government development. We need good researchers and development kind of people. We need that as an instrument as well. And we need an industry that can support what is needed in the future, and we need to leverage the talents and skills and entrepreneurial spirit that we find in the commercial world. So it's a blend of all those things, sir. I think that uniformed people have a specific job to do here and a skill set that is required that's a little different than those others because they're the ones that actually have to go employ forces in combat. But it's a broader set of questions, and we need a team that covers this skill set. By the way, cyberspace is a huge part of all of this, and so we need people that are very smart there as well.
Mr. Loverro.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So I want to echo again what General Kehler said and expand it. So what he described, when I listened to what he described, that describes a space-smart force for the nation, a force made of civilians and military and the industrial base that supports it. But let me not talk about the industrial base as much as the folks that are inside the DoD. Space is a different kind of domain than air, in the same way that undersea is a different domain than surface combatants. The Navy actually allows its three fundamental mission areas to grow separately. The career path for a submariner is different than the career path for a surface warrior, is different than the career path for a naval aviator, as it should be. Those domains are different. They require different skills, different training, different experience. The same is true for space. Space is a different kind of domain than air. We don't need to move it out of the Air Force in order to go ahead and create the space-smart civilian and military force that we need, but we need to allow it to grow differently than the way we would grow air officers, because those are different skill sets, different domain experiences, different technical requirements, and different operational and tactical problems.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll send in a few more questions for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate y'all being here. Talking about this is very important, raise awareness of the concerns that we have, the threats that we face. It's unfortunate, as Mr. Harrison talked about, we have overclassification of a lot of this information. The American people need to know, the Congress needs to know, which is why I'm glad you're here, about these threats, our vulnerabilities, and how we have to get after this. I was also pleased to see on social media a few minutes ago that Secretary Wilson, Heather Wilson, is testifying before the House Appropriations Defense Subcommittee this morning. The first question that Chairman Granger gave her was about President Trump's call for a Space Force. She politely said, "We look forward to the conversation." So, but I do look forward to this conversation. We're in my wheelhouse right now, and I appreciate all of y'all. You are all very sharp people. General Hyten at Stratcom and General Harris at PACOM have told us that in just a relatively short period of time, both China and Russia have become our peers, not our near peers, our peers in space, and moreover are on a trajectory to surpass our capabilities soon, because they are putting a larger percentage of their defense assets against this capability, and they have organizationally restructured. Do you share that opinion? Is that your view as well, that unless we do something dramatically different, that we are going to be surpassed by China and Russia in that domain?
Yes.
Mr. Loverro?
Sir, I'd hate to ever disagree with General Hyten. He's a good friend, and I've known him a long time. I disagree that there are our peers. I do agree with him that they are on a path to surpass us if we don't go ahead and get our act together.
Mr. Harrison?
I think that Russia and China, we have to view them as differently because they have different histories, and so they're coming from different trajectories. Russia was a great space superpower back in the day under the Soviets. They degraded significantly after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But in recent years, they have made a lot of efforts to regain a lot of their space capabilities, and they can still draw on that technical heritage that they had in the past, especially in terms of counter-space weapons that they had developed during the Cold War. They have that know-how, they have that expertise. It's not that difficult for them to field it again. And to understand how to use it operationally. China is a different situation, that they were not a great space power in the past. They are catching up. But I would agree with the sentiment that if they are not up here today, they will be in the near future if both countries continue on the trajectory
And
they are
would
now.
surpass us if we don't make some changes.
If we don't make some changes, it would not be hard at all for them to surpass us.
And would you agree that we have become heavily dependent on space to fight and win wars?
Absolutely. As I said in my oral and written testimony, we are heavily dependent on space across the full spectrum of combat. It's not just, nuclear war. It's not just high-end combat. It's even peacetime presence activities. We would not be able to operate as effectively as we do today without space.
So, again, leading questions. So would you agree that not making dramatic changes to get after this is not an option?
I would agree it's not an option. We desperately need to make a change in course and where we're headed today.
When you look at the Air Force budget in the last decade for space programs, would you say it represents or reflects that the Air Force views space as a priority? Mr. Harrison.
I think it reflects that we have stalled in our thinking. We've gotten frozen with fear, and we have not been able to make up our mind as an Air Force and as a nation on how we're going to move out to address these threats. So I think it's been stalled.
Mr. Loverro, same question. Does their budget reflect space being a priority?
I don't think so, sir. The DoD budget this last year went up by 16%. The space budget went up by 7%.
Same question, General Kehler.
So I was part of that, and what I would tell you is you have to be careful here because the Air Force went through a time where almost every single space asset was recapitalized, from missile warning to GPS to communications to the infrastructure that supports it. And so there was an investment time in the Air Force where that consumed a significant part of the Air Force's budget. Since then, no. And again, I think acquisition problems, saving the programs of record, has been a real problem. And by the way, I would agree, to just put a finer point on it, yes, if we don't act, there will be consequences for us in the future with Russia and China, but I also agree that I do not agree that they are necessarily our peers right now.
Okay.
Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will not let you off as easily as Chairman Rogers did. I would like each of you to answer two questions. Number one, what did the President mean yesterday when he said Space Force? And number two, what should he have meant in his remarks?
I noticed my good colleagues were looking in my direction, sir. Well, I don't know what he meant, sir, to be honest with you. I'm not an insider, and so I don't have the benefit of knowing sort of what conversations have been held with the Commander-in-Chief on this, so I really don't know. What should he have meant is really another question about what we should do. And I would tell you that while I think steps are necessary beyond what has been taken to date, to me, this is a matter of degree. If you're going to do something dramatic, then I think there's more than one model you could follow. And I would be urging that you carefully consider those because there are pros and cons to each one of those models. When I commanded Air Force Space Command before I commanded U.S. Strategic Command, I thought I was commanding most of the nation's military space forces. And so I think you have choices you can make here about what needs to happen next, and I would just urge you to be sensitive and thoughtful to what those are and what the pros and cons are of each.
So, sir, first of all, I don't know what the President meant, although many people have blamed me for making him say it, so, but that's not the case. Let me tell you what I think he should have meant. We have a military service whose sole mission is to prepare this nation to go ahead and win in the sea. We have a military service whose sole purpose is to prepare this nation to win on land. We have a military service in this nation whose sole purpose is to win in the air and to protect our interests in the air. And we now have at least a unified command whose sole purpose is to make sure we stay ahead and win in cyberspace. We lack that focus for space, one of our major 5 warfighting domains, and I may be biased, but I think one of the most important. That focus is necessary to create the long-term dynamic to keep us in the lead. And so when I think about a Space Force, I think about not just what's in Air Force Space Command today, I think about what's in the Missile Defense Agency. I think about the Army Space and Missile Defense Center. I think about the Naval Research Laboratory. I think about all of the components that create the ability to protect U.S. interests in, from, and through space. That should be our focus. What is the right organizational structure to create a service whose sole responsibility is to protect U.S. interests in, from, and through space? And I don't believe we have that today.
As my fellow panelist here said, I am not sure exactly what he meant. I saw the video, as I'm sure you did as well. It appeared that he was thinking kind of off the cuff, and he had not looked into the history. I would not presume that the President had read things like the Allard Commission report or the Rumsfeld Commission report that looked at these issues in the past. This is something that's been an ongoing discussion for at least 2 decades. I think what he should have meant, and there were some hints of this in his remarks, is that given the increased emphasis we are placing on space and the investments that are going into space, that we need to look at reorganizing our military around this domain so we can operate more effectively in this domain. And as I was sitting here thinking about this, I looked. Right here in front of us is a little plaque with Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And as you read that, it gives Congress the power to, raise an army and to maintain a navy. It doesn't mention air. Of course, there was no air domain at that time. That's just proof that we have to evolve our organizations. We have to evolve our thinking over time. And I think that we have reached that point now with space as a 4th physical domain, and then thinking of cyber as well as a 5th virtual domain, and that it is time that we rethink some of our major organizational structures around that. So I think that's what he should have meant, and should then lead to deeper discussion about how do we do that and how do we make this transition.
That plaque also reminds us what our job is in this, and sometimes it's easy for us to just look to the Pentagon to give us the answers, but that's not what the Constitution says. Mr. Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you. As our China and Russia get close to where we are now and or exceed us, at what point is there an opportunity for a Geneva Convention-like agreement as to how we would conduct ourselves in a fight like this, and then should that go forward? Who starts it, and how does that work? And then how would we try to link in non-state actors who could also have access to certain things that could be disruptive? So is there a Geneva Convention codicil in the works somewhere?
So I think the need for that is absolutely clear. Let me point back to January 2007 when the Chinese shot their own satellite and created thousands of pieces of debris in space. We all remember that date. When that happened, the entire world said that is unacceptable. Creating that much debris in space is unacceptable. And even the Chinese admitted it was unacceptable because they've never done it again. I believe that we should be negotiating with our adversaries that there are some kind of space weapons, just like chemical weapons on the land, or just like bombardment from the air. These kind of weapons are not acceptable. We know you're going to attack our space stuff. Fine, go for it. But let's not go ahead and create indiscriminate harm to other actors and to the environment while we do it. I actually believe we could get that agreement with China, probably with Russia after China, and then with the international community. I think that would be something that is in our national interest and their national interest to do?
And, sir, I agree that it's in our national interest, I think, to agree in the international community on some kind of what we called for a long time rules of the road. I think if you take other steps beyond that and start talking about formal arms control agreements and that sort of thing, those are very difficult. For a long time, we've struggled with just the concept of what constitutes a weapon in space. You can take almost anything that's in space today and use it as a weapon against something else that's in space if you have enough fuel to do it. So I think it would certainly benefit, it would help our commanders and our policymakers understand things like what constitutes hostile intent, what constitutes a hostile act. How do you know if someone is threatening you or not? I think this is going to be even harder when commercial interests go to orbit to do close proximity servicing, for example. Those are going to be difficult challenges for us, and there needs to be some structure around how we operate in space.
Mr. Harrison.
I would just echo those comments, but also add that, you know, in the long term, we do need something through United Nations, Geneva Conventions. The things we need to, you know, get clarified are, you know, what's considered a combatant versus a non-combatant in space, when these are all, for military purposes, they're unmanned platforms. What's a proportionate response to an attack in space? You know, we reserve the right to respond at the time, place, and domain of our choosing. If someone does something against a critical U.S. satellite, is it proportionate to do something on the ground that causes the direct loss of life? You know, I think those are questions we need to search through. In the near term, though, I think what we can do is have discussions with our allies and our partners about norms of conduct. You know, what are the rules of the road? What are the right ways to act? And if we set those and start following them ourselves, which I don't think would be hard to do, and get our allies and partners on board as well. Even if adversaries do not want to follow those, we at least have some basis of comparison to look at their actions. And it's complicated in space because of orbital mechanics, but, you know, simple things like how close of an approach to another uncooperating satellite is too close. It can get very complicated, but I think we need to work down through those questions and try to come to some sort of a consensus, at least within the United States.
Thank you. General, real quickly, the Uniformed Space Corps, Uniformed Space Fighter, Warfighter, is that group big enough to provide career, you know, longevity, career advancement, career challenges that would allow that to not be a dead-end career path?
I don't think so. I think that developing the uniformed piece of this is an important question as we go forward. I think that, you know, the services across the board have said they need to be bigger for lots of reasons. I think space falls into that category. I think that there are more uniformed people that are needed. And I think that you know, the points here earlier about making sure that there is a career progression, I think that there are models out there that we can use and we can follow. And again, a lot of the pieces are in place. We just need to go do it.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Ms. Bordello.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. General Kehler and Mr. Navarro and Mr. Harrison, thank you all for being here. General, the United States Strategic Command has identified an urgent need to rapidly reconstitute and replenish critical space capabilities to preserve continuity of operational capability. So can you please speak to some of the investments in low-cost, responsive launch options that you would recommend the department pursue to fulfill this need?
I would say, first of all, that in general terms, the department hasn't invested enough in the entire concept of operationally responsive space. How much should be invested in each of the parts, I think, is getting a pretty thorough review right now. What encourages me the most now is the launch developments that have occurred in the commercial world, because I think that the commercial activity here promises to, excuse me, to be a game changer, and in many ways has been a game changer to this point. So I would be looking to leverage commercial opportunities and low-cost commercial opportunities first before I went down the pathway of investing a lot more government money in government-sponsored kind of new launch capabilities, small launch capabilities. So that would be part one. Part two, what is done in operationally responsive space concepts needs to fit in with what my colleagues were talking about earlier with a new architecture approach to what we do on orbit. Things that are being talked about now inside the department, inside the Air Force, inside U.S. Strategic Command. Different architectural approaches, whether those are smaller payloads that are replenished sooner, whether it's ride sharing, whether it's leveraging commercial, all of those things that need to go into an overall architecture approach that I think then helps define where we need to invest, what we need to invest in. In my experience in the past, one of the issues has been you can deploy and buy small satellites. It's what you put on them that turns out to be the long pole in the tent, the payloads that go on them. So I think there's investment that's required. I don't know exactly where we should invest, but I would be careful about investing in small launch vehicles because I think commercial is going to get us there, and in many cases has taken us there now.
Thank you. My second question is, today, nearly all U.S. national security satellites are launched from fixed coastal U.S. launch sites that could easily be disrupted. So these fixed sites also provide predictable locations from which adversaries could glean clues to discern U.S. capabilities and other gaps. DOE developed more diverse launch sites using new commercial capabilities to address these weaknesses and support rapid, responsive, and resilient polar launch capability.
There have been alternative launch sites in existence for quite some time. For lots of reasons, they haven't really taken hold. I think this is another opportunity where I would like to see commercial enterprise take us there. But I agree with you. We ought to be more diversified and in getting to orbit, whether that's leveraging allied activities as well, or making sure that we're leveraging where commercial is going to include alternative means of launching, maybe taking things aloft on aircraft, et cetera. And a lot of those are underway right now in various commercial settings.
Yes. Well, General, I represent Guam, and there have been interested individuals out there trying to launch, doing their launch operations, and have visited our Air Force and also our commercial airport, our international Guam airport.
Right. SpaceX was on Kwajalein for a little while as well, and we've done launches from other places. I think it's a matter of, I would like to see commercial take us there, and my colleagues have views on this as well, I know.
Mm-hmm. Would anyone like to add to that, or?
Let me go ahead and add to that if you could, ma'am. So first of all, I absolutely agree we need more diversity in launch, although I always try to remind us that launch is part of getting the mission started, not the mission in and of itself. I am very excited by what I see in the commercial world in terms of small launch, whether that's Rocket Lab launching from New Zealand, Virgin Orbit with their plane that can launch from anywhere in the world, Straddle Launch trying to do the same kind of thing. These are commercial capabilities that we don't need to invest in, but we need to embrace. And that's the key that we have to understand. There's never going to be a time where we have the luxury of unlimited resources. We need to embrace these commercial and allied capabilities so that we can invest in the pointy end of the spear, not in the back end of the spear.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for the service that you give to our country in various ways. I sure appreciate it. I think we all do. Mr. Loverro, you said in your written testimony, quote, "A key element of any future space strategy is the ability to operationally test that strategy under real-life conditions," end quote. And you use an example that after losses in Vietnam, the Air Force created Red Flag, and that helped staunch the flow of losses. And we were talking about this yesterday. Could you follow on that? And because Representative Bordallo has mentioned her district, I'll mention my district. We've had some space flag exercises in Colorado Springs, and I think that's a good precedent here for this kind of testing that we need to do. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Absolutely, sir. I'd be pleased to. So, when we talk about testing and training environments within the DoD, we can mean anything from what's called a tabletop exercise, where nothing's actually happening other than written pieces of paper going back and forth, to full red flag exercises where we have people who are simulating aggressor tactics in aggressor-like aircraft against our own forces and actually trying to win the fight. And everywhere in between, simulators, computer-driven exercises. In the air world, in the sea world, in the land world, we cover that entire gamut because we understand to actually become an expert in that kind of warfighting, you must cover that entire gamut. In space, we are limited to computer simulations and tabletop exercises. Those are important, but insufficient. We need an investment in on-orbit assets that our warfighters can use to simulate tactics in space. Try out the plans they have developed. Did that work? Were we able to observe the adversary movement in the timeliness and thoroughness that we thought we would be able to? You can't know that from a computer. The computer will always tell you, yes, you observed it, because it's programmed to do that. You have to try that in space with real assets. That's a critical investment area. We know it's a critical investment area, but we are not investing there because it's, quite frankly, expensive, and we're spending money elsewhere, as Mr. Harrison has suggested and I suggested, and I think General Kehler would agree. We can allow the commercial world to pay for a lot of the things that we're investing in ourselves, so we can invest in things that the commercial world won't invest in, like test assets that we're going to fight in space. Those are a peculiar military need that we should be focused on.
General Kehler or Mr. Harrison, can you add anything about the need for more space warfighting training?
You need to take a page from every other domain, every other military service. If you want to have an effective warfighting force, you have to train, educate, exercise, test, simulate, do all those things. And for lots of reasons over the years, we have shortchanged space on many of those things. I will tell you that space is part of Red Flag. If you were to go to Red Flag, space is part of Red Flag. It's different to hold a space red flag. It's a little bit different focus. We've done one of those, I'm told, here fairly recently. The mechanisms are in place to do these things. I think it's a matter of focus and attention, and at some level, it's a matter of resources. If you want to have simulators and training and test assets and those kind of things, it costs money.
I would add that one thing that we should try to do differently in space and do better than we do in the other domains is how we measure readiness. And you know, our traditional approach to readiness is not serving us well because many of our measures are based on the inputs. Do we have enough people? Do we have enough people of the right training level? You know, how much training did we do in the past year? And it's more of a checkbox approach to get your sorts ratings that then go into the readiness system that then get presented and, you know, aggregated and presented to Congress. It's not sufficient in the other domains. It is certainly not sufficient in space. If you want an adequate picture of readiness, you need to do these exercises, you need to do these tests, and you need to measure performance. So, for example, as I said in my testimony, the ability to quickly detect and attribute different types of attack is important. Let's test that. Let's use whatever resources we have. Let's have a simulated attack. Let's see how long it takes to detect it and to attribute it to the right source. Let's measure those things, and let's report those as measures of readiness, not did we do the training or not, or did we have a, you know, the certain number of people.
Well, let's all move forward together on better and more advanced space warfighting training. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here today. The Department of Defense is conducting a study known as Analysis of Alternatives on how to best meet the exponentially increasing demand for satellite communications connectivity for military and government users. Even if the DoD completes its study on time, the timeline for providing increased satellite capacity would be no earlier than the late 2020s, resulting in a gap of time where military demand for connectivity could exceed supply. This means our military could face diminished communications capability while they're executing critical missions if the DoD does not procure additional spacecraft or capability. The current threat calls for more anti-jam capable satellites to provide assured communications for the warfighter in contested space. How should the Air Force plan to meet this need now, to all three of you?
Sir, the very best architecture studies, and the very best pathway to the future will continue to run headlong into an acquisition process that doesn't allow you to get there before the late 2020s or the early 2030s, unless we add some rapid acquisition capabilities to space, which I think is an urgent need to have happen. There needs to be an architecture an updated architecture, it was mentioned here by the panel before, that talks about communications, that involves the high-end protected communications that the government will need to do for itself, followed by the commercial communications that can be leveraged for government use, of which there are a lot of options out there and more coming every day. And then we need to change the model for how we go by it. Your point about an analysis of alternatives that takes years to complete and posits answers way in the future is not going to be acceptable. It's going to put us way behind, and I think is one of the urgent issues that needs to get addressed in terms of what do we ought to do to help ourselves out of this problem we have with space.
So let me add two thoughts to what General Kehler said, and one that may surprise members of this committee. I actually quite frankly recoil when I hear the fact that the problem is the acquisition problem. I think that's a shorthand for saying the real problem is the decision process, of which the acquisition process is part. We have to decide what to buy. Now, don't get me wrong, we're slow at buying things using normal defense planning, and we should be faster at that. But we canceled the TSAT program, the anti-jam capable system that we intended to build in the early part of this century. We canceled it in 2009. We have yet to decide what to replace it with, much less begin the program. That's not an acquisition problem, that's a decision problem. And that decision problem exists because there's too many people who can have an opinion in that debate. Regardless of AOAs, regardless of all the thinking, the Air Force doesn't get to make that decision themselves. I think if they did, the Air Force would have decided. I can't tell you if they would have decided right or wrong, but I can tell you they would have decided, a program would be underway, we would all be worried about how long the program was taking, but the program would already be there. We have a decision process within DoD because we have not centralized thinking about space in the same way we centralize thinking about air, land, and sea. So the second question, how do we get there faster? You know, there are 450 commercial communication satellites in the geosynchronous belt. There are going to be, in the next 10 years, upwards of 4,000 to 5,000 communication satellites in the low Earth orbit belt. We should be actively investing in those capabilities today. In fact, the official Air Force plan is to not buy another communication satellite like the wideband global satellite, but rather to invest in those commercial companies to have them field the capabilities we need in terms of anti-jam. And yet that program has not been funded adequately since the Air Force first presented it over 7 years ago. That program would have already yielded significant capability in space, and we wouldn't need an AOA to come to the conclusion that knowledgeable people already have, that that's the best way to get that. We should be investing today in cyber hardening of all of these LEO constellations so that we can use them for our warfighters, because they're going to be up there in 4 or 5 years, and our warfighters will not be able to depend upon them because their ground systems will not have the cyber protections necessary that we could pay for by pennies on the dollar as these systems are developed. Those kind of decisions are decision problems. I don't like to call them acquisition problems because they're a decision to act. There'll be an acquisition problem beyond that. Let's decide to act first, and that's where we've really fallen down, is deciding to act.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Harrison, is there something briefly you want to add to this question?
I would briefly add to that part of it is that we have built up institutions around certain mission areas and doing missions in a certain way. We've had a wideband program office, the Space and Missile Systems Center. Their job has historically been to acquire wideband satellites. Now we're looking at an era where we don't need to acquire them. We can buy it as a service. Well, buying SATCOM as a service has been the responsibility of DISA, an entirely different organization, an entirely different chain of command, and an entirely different budget. When your organization is fractured like that, it is hard to make a good decision and to be able to make adequate trade-offs. And so that's why I think we see the military struggling with this analysis of alternatives. It's just the institutions that we built aren't fit for the needs that we have today.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for the additional time.
Yep. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. And Mr. Loverro, I listened closely to what you said about canceling a mission that they were, or a platform they were about to purchase in 2009, and here they are. They still haven't decided what they're going to use to replace the mission. The J-STARS mission comes to mind as I listen to that, and as I look at us becoming more and more dependent on space, it seems to me that the acquisition process, the decision, if you will, becomes more complex and perhaps takes longer to actually field the items that we need than an airplane or a tank or something along those lines. But to read directly from your remarks, make no mistake, in all three U.S. space sectors, national security, civil, and commercial, the U.S. continues to lead the world. It talks about others catching us. But so you say that we lead the world, but yet we're totally dependent upon the acquisition of Russian rockets to launch our space-based capabilities. And those two things seem to be in conflict with each other. How is it that we dominate, but we don't have the ability to launch our own capabilities? And if you were sitting in the Russian shoes, wouldn't you simply take away that ability from the U.S. if you saw that they were about to launch a great system?
So that's a very difficult question you've posed for me there. Number one, I don't think we should be dependent upon Russian rockets, and we could have made decisions way in the past to change that. In fact, there was direction from three successive acquisition chiefs in the Pentagon to make that not happen, and it was ignored, unfortunately, every time, starting as far back as 2004. That is a reliance that we should not have, and we should correct that, and we are on the path to correct it, but we should have corrected it long ago. Number two, will the Russians go ahead and eliminate their provisions of those engines for strategic reasons? I don't know what's in their mind. I find it hard to understand.
Do you agree that they could?
They could, and that's a vulnerability we can't stand.
Sure.
We know how to build rocket engines in the United States of America. We've built the most powerful rocket engines ever developed in the world in the United States of America, and we have, not only through NASA and through the Air Force, but also through commercial world, we have the most robust launch infrastructure of any nation in any time in history today. I really do want to salute the DoD for changing their tune on things like SpaceX, and I want to salute ULA for making the changes they've made.
I'm down to about 2 minutes, if I may. One of the things that has been talked about is the difficulty of defending our space-based capabilities, the jamming equipment that is available, which is a serious concern to me, and the ability to break our communications if we become too dependent on space and don't have redundant communication systems. Where does that leave us, and how vulnerable do we become by becoming dependent with no redundant system to communicate without it? And it brings me to a question for you, General Kehler. If our space-based capabilities are attacked, can you speak to the ability to reconstitute those capabilities along with the anticipated timeline and what this would mean operationally for continued warfighting, assuming we have no redundancies?
Yes, well, you nailed it. I think this is an architectural question. We can't be in a position where our forces can't operate without space. And by the way, I don't think we would be. What happens, though, is that it's like a time machine. The more space you take away, the farther back in time our forces go in terms of how they would operate. So I think we have some significant issues about connectivity for nuclear command and control and other things that rely very heavily on space. So we can't find ourselves in that position.
As a general, if you're in a battle and you lose your space-based communications and you have no redundancy and you had to repair the space-based communications.
Right. We do not have the wherewithal today to quickly replenish in a significant way what we could lose in terms of a determined adversary attack on space.
My concern is that the battle would be over and potentially the war before we could ever get the run. I'm out of time, Mr. Harrison. If the chairman, I think he had a comment.
You have something you want to add? I get more flexible as time goes on.
Okay. I'll take advantage of that then. Now, I would just add that we may not want to focus too much on rapid reconstitution. That's one way to improve mission assurance. But it's really, you know, if you think through it in a war crisis type exercise, it's only good for a limited set of circumstances. So depending on the type of attack, you may not want to reconstitute right away because you would just be launching another billion-dollar satellite that will just get destroyed again. Also, if it's, you know, you may have created a lot of debris, you might not want to launch into that orbit. But also, if it's a non-kinetic attack, particularly a reversible attack, like jamming, they're just going to jam that one as well. So I think what we really ought to be looking at first and foremost is how to avoid getting in that situation where we would need to reconstitute. How do we develop systems that degrade more gracefully? How do we develop systems that are just harder to attack so that someone, instead of attacking in space, they'll choose to attack in another domain through another vector?
Okay. Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I just want to expand on some of the discussion you just had. Over the last few years, our NATO agreement started to address the cyber. It's not as clear. When a soldier come at you, you know who it is. In space, you talked about the jamming issue. Let's talk about kinetic strikes. What is our ability to track where that attack came from, A, from a physical standpoint, and then who's controlling what happened? Oh, I'm sorry, General.
Sir, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking...
If there was an attack, physical attack in space on one of our assets.
Right. Well, it's not nearly what it needs to be. We are very good at tracking rockets and missiles of certain classes and sizes that get launched from the face of the Earth. We're very good at that. Once things are on orbit, though, we have significant deficiencies in how quickly we can detect that something has maneuvered, how quickly we can detect that something might be approaching an asset of high value, and the list goes on. We have some
in terms of tracking debris or satellites.
Yep, and it's true across the board with debris or hostile actors or other satellites that happen to be up there. And this is why certainly the military has been arguing for quite some time that we need to invest more in what they call space situational awareness. We need to get from a time where they're basically maintaining a catalog of what's up there and checking it periodically to see what changes to real-time situational awareness like we would have in the air if we were in a conflict.
Funny you should mention that. We have an off-the-shelf piece that we've been discussing for a number of years. But that will show you where the asset is versus the other asset in terms of an actual attack.
Right.
How do you track that
And
piece?
then there's being able to track in sort of close proximity to one another, and then there's deciphering what actually happened to you, whether what happened is a technical problem or some hostile act. Those are all things that need to be worked because we aren't nearly where we need to be in all of those areas.
In terms of debris, debris is a relative term, some accidental, some very deliberate. If there was an intentional, and this is under the guise that we're going to have a very bad day, but debris is probably one of the easiest things to put up there to disrupt us. Maneuverability in short terms for our assets to get out of the way. How would you rate our ability to do that today?
So I want to, let me address the question in two ways. First of all, if you want to attack something in a military effective way, debris isn't a particularly good way to do it. Debris is a long-term problem, but not a short-term preferred method of attacking, because space, what we don't understand how big space really is. We could move out of the way of debris. We do it all the time. The space station does it all the time. Air Force Space Command tracks the debris, and the space station maneuvers if it believes it's going to be too close. And we can do that for most of our satellites that are in a debris area, which are our low Earth satellites. Some of our older satellites no, but most of our satellites that have been launched in the last 20 years could do that. The big problem is what might look like debris may actually be a deliberate attack. That's the harder problem to deal with. And some CubeSat that has minimal propulsion could easily go ahead and impact into a multi-billion-dollar satellite and destroy it. And that might and it would be very difficult for us to detect that movement and very difficult for us to attribute who caused that to occur.
And I would add to that part of the problem with debris is it has indiscriminate long-term effects, right? And so it's going to affect anyone in a similar orbital regime. In terms of maneuverability, the real question is, how feasible is it to maneuver out of the way of a homing warhead of some kind? So something that's not an unguided piece of debris, but something that is trying actively to steer its way into you. That is a very tough problem in physics because that warhead is small. The amount of propellant it needs to maneuver is exponentially smaller because of the weight, and it is willing to expend 100% of its propellant to hit you, whereas your satellite, you're large, you're lumbering, you're slow-moving, you have limited propellant reserves on board, and you do not want to expend much of that propellant because that will ultimately shorten the life of your system. So maneuverability, in many cases, is just not a feasible option against any kind of a homing warhead.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To all the panelists, in fiscal year 2018, Congress authorized advanced procurement for SBIRS, Space Vehicle 7 and 8. However, the Air Force is no longer interested in procuring SV 7 and 8. Instead, the Air Force would like to disaggregate strategic and tactical payloads from one another. However, the Air Force is still planning to use the same spacecraft buses, the same quote-unquote big juicy targets, as General Hayden calls it. Does this approach initiate risk by cutting short the program of record, especially before it has reached full operational capability? Please explain why or why not. General, let's start with you.
So, Congressman, here's where I would agree with them. I would agree that we should not continue to do business as usual. The alternative, though, I'm not clear yet on whether the alternative is substantially a different approach. If it is, then I would support it. If it isn't, then I would continue to have the same question that General Hayden has. And so I would listen very carefully to kind of where the combatant commander comes out on this to assess whether he thinks his warfighting capabilities are being materially improved by an action that the service is taking. So they should be in lockstep on this, and I don't know if there's some issues about having to transition some way, or I don't know what the other factors are that they considered. But I do agree that business as usual is not the way to go forward on that and other constellations as well, and they need to come up with alternative ways to make themselves more resilient and defensible.
Mr. Loverro.
Yes, sir, I agree wholeheartedly with General Kehler. First of all, I don't think we should build any more SBIRS. We have enough SBIRS and DSP satellites to last us well to the end of the next decade. What we need to do is build a more resilient missile warning architecture than we have today. And as best I can tell from the budget documents, what has been specified is not any more resilient than what we have today. It may be new, but it's not more resilient because it's using the same bus, as you already stated. It still remains the big, juicy target that's going to still take 8 to 10 years to develop. That's unacceptable. We have alternatives today. They have been proven. They have been flown. They have been shown to be effective, that we could easily launch within 3 years, 5 years at the outside, given the budget process. And yet we have chosen not to do that because, as Mr. Harrison has said, culturally, we don't think about the problem that way, and they would be far more resilient than what we have today.
Mr. Harrison?
I would agree that I'm not sold on the new path forward on SBIRS. I think disaggregating the strategic and tactical missions onto different satellites that are basically the same as what we have today, I don't think that improves our resilience or our deterrence against an adversary, because are they really going to believe of what's on what satellite? I think we need to break up that mission, break it open, and look at it more broadly. And I think that there's a good case to be made for our tactical missile warning needs, that they could be better met in low Earth orbit with a large constellation of smaller satellites in low Earth orbit that are used not just for detection of a launch, but for tracking and target discrimination in mid-course. If you talk to folks in the Missile Defense Agency, they will tell you that the single most important thing we could do to improve the effectiveness of our theater and national missile defense systems is better tracking and target discrimination in mid-course. That's what they need. We could do that with a constellation in low Earth orbit.
Would it be more prudent and responsible to incorporate a new start after 7 and 8? To include the option of augmenting capabilities through a payload? Don't have a lot of time, but General?
It depends, I think, on how quickly and whether it's affordable and whether we have enough agility to actually make a big transition now. If you can, then I would transition. If you can't, then this is the first rule of wing walking. Don't let go until you're holding on. Okay. So I would just want to make sure we were cautious about how we did it.
Mr. Loverro?
Sir, I do not believe that we should buy 7 and 8 under any conditions. It is the wrong strategic tool for our warfighters, and that should drive our thinking, not our fear of something new. We know how to apply things better if we want to. We've got to go ahead and overcome that fear, and I am fully confident we have enough time, given the 6 SBIRS satellites we've already bought, and the classified number of DSP satellites that are still in operation.
Mr. Chairman, may I finish? Mr. Harrison, can you respond quickly?
I would quickly add and say that I think in terms of the strategic missile warning mission, more payloads in more places is better. That will make us more resilient. So if we can take the payloads similar to what's on our SBIRS satellites and put them just in more places, if we can host payloads, we've done the commercially hosted infrared payload experiment in the past, more of that will help make the system more resilient. So I think that would be a good use of funding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I appreciate your expert testimony. And I used to work with General Kehler when I was the 1-star at Offutt Air Force Base, and he was the 4-star STRATCOM commander. And I have a funny memory I just got to share real quick. My 4-star boss was at Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, and I remember General Kehler saying, "Your dad may be at Langley, but I'm your great uncle. And I talk to your dad all the time." So it's good to be with my great uncle here. So when we look at having a new Space Force and having that debate, I think a couple of things that we need to look at. One of them is acquisition and the decision-making process, as you say. I think Mike Rogers does a great job showing all the duplication that goes on there amongst the services, and that there may be it's got to be a better way to do it. But the one that concerns me more is the culture and building a warfighting space culture. And when our space warfighter lieutenants come in and our airmen come in, I think we need to have that thought process. If they're the very best, they can achieve service chief 35 years later. And I don't know that we can say that today with the Air Force. I think we have to just be honest. It's a fighter pilot-oriented culture, 80% anyway. I mean, we have bomber pilots and airlifters, but by and large, it's a fighter pilot culture. If you look at our service chiefs going back a couple decades, with maybe one exception, it's been a fighter pilot. And I got to tell you, General Goldfein is the best of the best. I think he's an outstanding leader. I think he's onto this problem too. How do we build a space warrior culture within the Air Force? The Navy's obviously done it. They have submariners, surface, aviators, all of them compete equally for that service chief's job or the CNO position. So my question to you three today would be, how does the Air Force work to getting a culture where the space and the air domain, the fighter pilot culture becomes equal? How do we change that to become more like what the Navy has today? Is it doable? And I will say, I know General Goldfein is committed to this, but I think it's a hard task. And I embrace his desire, but how does this happen? And I turn the floor over to you.
Congressman, I was really glad that this wasn't some retribution for me commenting about being your uncle. First, I think I would ask myself, is it feasible? Is it feasible for the United States Air Force to do what it is that needs to be done? I'm a non-pilot in the United States Air Force for 39 years. I believe it's feasible for the United States Air Force to do what needs to be done here. And I think what needs to be done is there needs to be a conscious effort to over-nurture space for a time until it gains that kind of traction that we're talking about here. I think and that's a step, by the way. It may be that we need to go to a separate Space Corps or a separate Space Force or something in the future, but those are really, really big steps that bring with them other things that we ought to think about carefully, I believe. I do think that the pieces are in place there today in the Air Force. We haven't sat there idly over the last 20 years, as a matter of fact, since Desert Shield and Desert Storm. There's a lot that has been done inside the Air Force, but what has not happened, I think, is that it has not gotten the consistent priority treatment that it needs to include a management of personnel that makes non-aviators warfighters through the processes that the warfighters go through, or through that the aviators go through as well. Similar processes to that. I think it's doable. I think it requires a deliberate action on the part of the Air Force, and I think it involves helping this hybrid command called Air Force Space Command that has the pieces that it needs to grow up some more too, with some acquisition authorities and other things. So I think it's feasible. I think it's possible. In the near term, my preference would be to see that, because we have urgent matters that need to be solved. I would hold the people in those jobs accountable for solving them instead of coming up with something new that could be a distraction. So I'm not opposed, but I would be careful about how we go forward here.
Thank you, General Kehler, and I know General Goldfein's committed to that. I've talked to him personally. Mr. Loverro.
Yes, sir. So General Kehler and I have argued about this before. It's a question of, do you peel the Band-Aid off slowly or do you rip the Band-Aid off? I'm ready to rip the Band-Aid off. The Air Force Space Corps needs an identifiable existence within the Air Force. Today, the Air Force Space Corps is made up of 2,000 individuals who are called space operators. They have a specific identification code. There are 2,000 of them. That's all there ever will be. You can't build a corps out of that. There are another 3,000 who do space acquisition, who are not identified as space warriors, who should be, because they have the skills. They're distributed between the NRO and the Space and Missile Systems Center. There are another several hundred who are space intelligence officers, space maintainers, space thinkers. None of these people are identified as space people, and therefore we cannot get to the requisite number of space smart folks who have the variety of those experiences necessary to build that space warrior in the future. The path that leads to a pilot doesn't include Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The path that leads to a space warrior probably does include the NRO and the Space and Missile Systems Center. There are two different paths. There are different career progressions, and the Air Force is unable to go ahead and manage that within their current personnel system.
I would add one more thing, and I think it actually is a larger issue than just space within the Air Force. I think it's a broader issue that Congress needs to address of DOPMA reform. And the personnel system overall needs to be updated, quite frankly. That some parts of the career model that were built in decades ago are no longer working very well. Things like the up or out promotion system. And all of the joint service requirements and all of the educational requirements that we put on folks. I think that is contributing to the pilot shortfall in the Air Force, quite frankly. I think it's also contributing to the lack of ability to create a viable space cadre within the Air Force. So I think this is a bigger personnel reform issue that I'm hopeful Congress will tackle.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, could I know that I'm probably violating some terrible rule here. No. Could I just add one other thing?
Of course.
5 of the last 6 commanders, 4-star commanders of Air Force Space Command, have been non-pilots. The other one was a pilot, but he was also a 3-time shuttle pilot. He qualifies, as far as I'm concerned. Anybody who has been a satellite, I think, is okay to command Air Force Space Command. 3 of those 6 have become the commander of U.S. Strategic Command, a combatant commander. In the last couple of times that the Air Force has considered senior officers to be the chief of staff, I know that some of those officers were actively considered to be the chief of staff. So I think that to suggest that somehow that there has been no progress here is not a good way to think about this. I do think there are problems that need to be addressed, and I think that there are issues for the Air Force to address that have been laid out for quite some time that can be addressed. But I just wanted to point out that there are some things here that I think you should take note of.
Mr. Heiss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Harrison, I'd like to follow up on a comment you made that you're more concerned with the non-kinetic threats in space right now. I'd like to expound a little bit more on that, specifically in regard to is the concern that it's harder to attribute the attacks? Is it that it's harder for us to counter the attacks? Is it a threat to our satellites? All the above or whatever? If you could just go further with it.
I am more concerned about the non-kinetic types of threats because I think they're harder to deter for a variety of reasons. And so when I say non-kinetic, I'm talking about electronic forms of attack like jamming or spoofing a signal, where you fool a receiver into thinking what they're receiving is really from the satellite when it's not. Also, non-kinetic forms of physical attack, where you can do physical damage to the satellite without actually touching it. Like lasing a satellite. If you laze an imagery satellite, you can potentially blind it or at least temporarily dazzle it. High-power microwave weapons can cause the electronics on a satellite to be disrupted, cause computers to reboot, or can actually fry the circuits in a satellite if it's a strong enough attack and they're not well protected. Then, of course, there's cyber attacks. Cyber attacks can be in many different forms. At the lowest level, someone could just get into your network and be able to snoop on packets, who's talking to whom. They may be able to crack into encryption and actually read the data and exploit that for military purposes. At the most extreme level of a cyber attack, they could get into your data streams and manipulate the data. Worst attack you can imagine would be if someone gets in to your command and control uplink and takes control of your satellite, then they can effectively destroy it, at least make it not usable to you. Now, our military satellites have protections against some of these, but not all of these, and it varies by the type of system. And so, I'm concerned about these threats because, one, an adversary may think that they could use an attack that they don't think we can attribute to them and get away with it. So they may use it even before a conflict on Earth begins. It may be part of their conditioning of us or trying to prepare the battlefield. Also, an adversary may view something like jamming, that's a reversible form of attack. They may view it as being below threshold, that they can do it, and we will know that they can turn it off. And so they can just negotiate with us. We may not view it the same way. Our protected satellite communications systems, they're used for nuclear command and control as well as tactical missions. An adversary may miscalculate, and they may think that we would view it as less below a threshold when we actually view it as being above a threshold. The other complication is that our allies and partners may not view the same type of attack the same way that we do. And so I know there are some ongoing discussions. I think there need to be more ongoing discussions, and it's at this lower end of the spectrum of conflict where I think it gets very murky, and that's why it concerns me. Not to discount the kinetic ASAT attacks. Those, yes, have very devastating consequences, but I think we need more attention in the non-kinetic side.
Mr. Loverro?
Yes, Mr. Heiss, I want to add to what Mr. Harrison has said. So, and this is a critically important point. One of, as we put together our policies and our thinking about resilience, one of the key goals was to force if the adversary wanted to take away your space capabilities, was to force him to a higher level of attack, i.e. kinetic attack, to take away the so-called cheap shot of a laser or a jamming attack. Remove that from the thinking so that you would clearly have an active war if he tried to attack your satellites. We know how to build jam-resistant satellites. We know how to build architectures of satellites that cannot be jammed in individually or collectively. We know how to go ahead and build jam-resistant GPS. We know how to go ahead and build satellites that can't be blinded by lasers from the ground. We know how to do all of these things. We need to be doing them so that the only option an adversary has is to go ahead and attack us kinetically. And then we need to build architectures where the loss of a single satellite attacked kinetically doesn't affect us militarily, but now gives the president the wherewithal to act. So these are critically important strategic architectural questions that we have to address, and we're not doing.
So are there any policy decisions on our end that need to be implemented?
The policy that I just told you exists. It's written. It was delivered in 2014 to the White House as part of our overall ability to resist these or to contend with these problems. We're not building the capabilities. There's always more policy work to be done. Don't get me wrong. Otherwise I'd be out of business. But the fact of the matter is, the fundamental policies we need to understand what to do are there. We have to act on those policies.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Whose job is it to make those architectural decisions?
Sir, that's the key issue, and that's why I say it's not an acquisition issue, it's a decision issue. In the 20 years that spanned 1990 to 2010, we basically allowed that decision to be made by the acquisition chain in the AT&L. That was never that individual's job, but since nobody else would make a decision, he did, or he or she did. Before that, back in the 60s and the 70s, it was the responsibility of the DDR&E, the Deputy Director for Research and Engineering. In the 1980s, late 80s and 90s, it was responsibility for the Assistant Secretary of Defense for C-cubed-I. They were the person in the OSD staff who would listen to the services come in and say, we would like to do this, and they would basically say yes or no. I often tell the tale that when I was running the GPS program and I didn't believe we were on the right path, I walked into John Stenbett's office. He was the ASDC-3I. I sat down with him for 3 days and explained what we needed. He said, yes, you're right. Let's take it to the deputy. I was at the deputy's office a week later. In less than 2 months, we had changed the entire course of the GPS program. Today, I'd have to go talk to 20 different people in the Pentagon. None of them have the ability to go ahead and make that decision. That's the problem that we have to go ahead and solve. The Air Force, I believe, will come up with excellent ideas if we give them the responsibility to do that. And they should have the responsibility to do that. And then they should be responsible for bringing that to the individual in OSD who can say yes or no. And they either get a yes or no, go back and work it again. But that will create the kind of pace of change that we need rather than the current structure.
I would add to that, you know, I would choose to interpret some recent changes that Congress made in a way, and I don't know that folks within the Pentagon would agree with this, but I think it was the FY17 NDAA that split up AT&L and gave more acquisition authority to the services. So the acquisition authority devolved to the services for many of these programs. And then in last year's FY18 NDAA, it clearly gave the commander of Air Force Space Command authority, the sole authority for recruit, training, equipping space forces. I would then interpret that as the commander of Air Force Space Command should be the one who can make these decisions and move out on it.
He doesn't have all the authority he needs to do that. And I mean, I take the point about the decision process and the acquisition process. To me, it's kind of tomato-tomato. I think that this is all rolled together. What has happened with the fragmentation of acquisition in larger sense has impacted space as well. I agree. I think that the commander of Air Force Space Command has responsibility here to develop space architectures. I had that responsibility when I sat out there, and what I didn't have was the responsibility to develop the department's communications architecture. I could do the space piece of it, but I didn't have the wherewithal to do the rest. That was somebody else's responsibility, and once I had what I thought I needed to do, my responsibility was to take it into the Air Force and get it programmed. So I think that channel is there. I think that channel is still there. Again, I think this is about priorities. If these are national priorities, then I think it gets looked at differently in the program process when we're trying to decide what to fund and what not to fund.
Mr. Rogers?
I just want to, again, thank the panel. This is a very important discussion for us to have. I hope that people take away from this hearing the one theme that came out early and has recurred throughout it, and that is we can't keep doing what we've been doing. We have to do something dramatically different, better, more efficient, and more effective. As y'all all know, I believe that we have to segregate those 5,000 people that Doug Loverro described into a separate service, the Space Force, in the Department of the Air Force, in order to get that culture and educational system and career development that we need to make space a priority. And the point being, and one of the reasons why General Kehler and I kind of divulge on this is, I believe that in order for us to ever correct this, that the people that come to work every day and work on space have to know that it's their number one priority. It's the organization's number one priority. And the Air Force will always have air dominance as its number one priority culturally. And it should. It's the Air Force. So we just have to recognize no organization can have two number one priorities. And I think that's going to be the leap. Because General Kehler's right. It could possibly happen, but it's probably not going to happen. If it would have been likely, the Air Force would have done it by now. They're humans, and it's just hard to do what we're asking them to do in their current construct. And one of the evidence would be when you talked about the 4 stars space professionals who were considered for chief. They didn't get chief. But you did make a point that I agree with, that in the interim, between now and when I think we're going to have a Space Force, like our Commander-in-Chief said yesterday, I like him. Even better today. But between now and then, I think General Kehler is exactly right. The Department of the Air Force should make space a very high priority and fund it appropriately and give it inordinate attention. That means resources, a different acquisition construct, and maybe a space professional as the next chief of staff, like John Hyten or somebody else. Those would be great signals to the Congress. They're finally getting it. But I still think we're going to have to make this evolution to a separate, segregated service. And I think this hearing goes a long way to putting that information on the record, and I thank you all for being a part of it. I yield back.
Last question. Is there something that jumps to any of your minds that has been written in the last few years that, not technical, but would be helpful for Congress to read in thinking about space as a warfighting domain? I'm just curious.
Sir, it's not the last few years, but it's 2001, written by the Rumsfeld Commission. We all were part of it, or at least I guess I know General Kehler and I were part of it. I'm not sure about Todd. But I don't think a more thorough description of the problem or the solution exists than that report. It is prescient in its understanding of what was going to happen, because everything it perceived to happen has happened. It spoke about the fact that we need to get on the path for a Space Corps then. Now, 19 years later, we're still not on that path, because it saw that the only way to go ahead and deal with this problem was to get on that path early. I still find it to be the Bible for most of this thinking, and if you care to read all of the appendices, all the details spring out at you. So I would heartily recommend a review of that report.
Okay. Anything else?
I would agree. There have been a lot of studies done. I think that's the best one if you were parachuting in to take a look at this. I think that one, it sets the conditions, and I think it lays out the issues in a very, very good way. I would say, though, that some things have changed between then and now. I think the threat that got talked about there has arrived, and I think that we just need to be cautious here that in going forward, and by the way, I do not disagree that somebody should come to work every day thinking about space as a full-time job. That was my job, as a matter of fact, in Air Force Space Command. And I think that that's necessary. I do believe that there are things that have to be done here, just like we've been talking about. What I am concerned about, though, is how far you go and how fast you get there. Because my experience with major organizational changes is that they always take longer and cost more than we think. And so I don't think we have the luxury of a lot of time. I think we have people in place today who have organizations that can be responding, and we need to make them do it.
You know, one book that comes to mind is Crowded Orbits by Clay Moltz. I think that's a good reading, and it's a little more contemporaneous. I also agree, though, that the Rumsfeld Commission report is a great read, especially when it comes to the organizational aspects that we've discussed much today. And as someone who writes and publishes for a living, I can't miss the opportunity to promote one of my own reports, but we published a report last fall called Escalation and Deterrence in the Second Space Age. So if you don't have a copy, we'll be glad to get you one.
No, I appreciate that. I think just like in cyber, there are elements of space as a warfighting domain that are challenging for members to think about. Because while you can draw analogies to underwater and other things, there are differences, and so that's part of the reason I asked the question. I think this has been very helpful today. Thank each of you for being here. The hearing stands adjourned.